It was an ordinary November evening when Jake, a regular commuter, boarded the subway for his usual late-night ride home. The train was nearly empty, its fluorescent lights flickering faintly. The dull hum of the engine and the occasional screech of the wheels against the rails filled the air. Jake settled into his favorite seat, halfway down the car, and pulled out a book to pass the time. As the train rattled through the underground tunnels, Jake couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. He wasn't sure why at first, but the atmosphere felt heavier than usual. Glancing up from his book, he noticed a shadowy figure sitting at the far end of the car. The person was completely still, their face obscured by the dim lighting and the angle of their hood. Jake wasn't usually one to spook easily, but the figure's presence unnerved him. Their posture seemed unnatural, rigid, almost statue-like. He dismissed his discomfort, chalking it up to exhaustion, and tried to focus on his book again. Yet, the feeling of being watched grew stronger with every passing moment. The subway car jolted slightly as it sped through another tunnel. Jake looked up again, this time more deliberately. The shadowy figure was still there, in the exact same position. Their head appeared to be angled slightly toward him now, as if they were watching him. Jake's throat tightened, and a chill ran down his spine. He tried to calm himself. It's just another passenger, he thought. They're probably tired, like me, but deep down he felt something was wrong. He couldn't see the person's face clearly, but the shadowy figure radiated an unsettling aura, something he couldn't quite put into words. Suddenly, the train's lights flickered violently, plunging the car into near darkness for a few seconds. When the lights came back on, Jake instinctively scanned the car. His heart dropped. The figure was gone. Jake blinked in confusion, his eyes darting to every seat. The subway car was completely empty now, just him and the rumbling noise of the train. He felt his pulse quicken. He hadn't heard the sound of footsteps, nor the whoosh of the doors opening. The figure couldn't have left. As Jake sat frozen, trying to make sense of what had just happened, a faint sound broke the silence. It was barely audible at first, but it grew louder, a soft, almost rhythmic whisper. The sound seemed to be coming from behind him. Slowly, Jake turned his head toward the subway car window. The glass reflected his face, pale and tense, and the dim, empty interior of the car. But as his eyes adjusted to the reflection, he noticed something else. A shadowy outline stood just behind him, faint and almost translucent. Jake's breath hitched. He spun around, clutching his seat for support, but the space behind him was empty. The whispering stopped abruptly, leaving only the sound of the train in motion. Jake's hands trembled as he sat back down, his mind racing. The subway slowed as it approached the next station, and Jake's instincts screamed for him to get off the train. As soon as the doors slid open, he bolted out of the car, barely looking back. Standing on the platform, he finally dared to glance at the subway car as the train pulled away. And there it was. The shadowy figure stood motionless in the doorway, watching him. Its outline seemed to fade into the darkness of the car as the train disappeared into the tunnel. Jake never took the subway at night again. To this day, he can't explain what he saw or what it wanted. But whenever he hears the faint hum of a passing train, he feels a chill, as if the shadowy passenger is still out there, waiting. It was past midnight, and the subway platform was nearly deserted. Sarah, a young woman returning from a long day at work, waited alone for the last train of the night. The air was cold, the faint hum of fluorescent lights overhead adding to the eerie silence. When the train finally arrived, she stepped into the empty car and settled into a seat near the door, clutching her bag tightly. As the train pulled out of the station, Sarah noticed a faint movement from the corner of her eye. Sitting just a few seats away was a child, no older than 8, dressed in old-fashioned clothes, a woolen coat, a flat cap, and scuffed shoes. Sarah hadn't seen the child board the train, but she figured he must have gotten on at the same time as her. The boy looked nervous, his small hands gripping the edge of the seat. He seemed lost, his eyes darting around as if searching for something or someone. Concerned, Sarah leaned forward and spoke gently. "Hey there, are you okay? Are you lost?" The boy turned to look at her, his pale face partially obscured by the brim of his cap. His voice was soft but clear. "I'm looking for my parents." Sarah felt a pang of sympathy. "Do you know where they are? Where are you supposed to get off?" The boy hesitated, then raised a trembling hand and pointed toward the dark subway tunnel beyond the window. Confused, Sarah followed his gaze, but there was nothing there, just endless blackness stretching into the distance. "Are your parents on the train?" she asked, her voice steady despite the growing unease in her chest. The boy didn't respond. Instead, he stared at the tunnel, his expression blank and distant, as if he were in a trance. The train jolted suddenly, causing the lights to flicker. When they stabilized, Sarah realized the boy was no longer in his seat. She stood up quickly, her eyes darting around the car. "Hey, where did you go?" she called out, her voice echoing in the empty train. There was no response. The only sound was the clattering of the wheels on the tracks. Sarah's pulse quickened as she moved down the aisle, peering into every seat. The boy had vanished. She glanced toward the window again, and her stomach dropped. Reflected in the glass was the boy, standing in the middle of the car, staring directly at her. But when she turned around, the space behind her was empty. A cold chill swept through the car, and Sarah's breath came out in visible puffs. The train felt impossibly cold, as though all the warmth had been sucked out of the air. She backed up toward the door, her heart pounding. Suddenly, the boy's voice rang out, clear and haunting. "They're still in the tunnel. I need to find them." The sound didn't seem to come from anywhere in particular. It was everywhere at once. Sarah gripped the cold metal pole beside her, trying to steady herself. The train screeched as it began to slow for the next station. Sarah's panic spiked, and she bolted for the doors. As soon as they slid open, she stumbled onto the platform, her legs shaky. Turning back to the car, she saw the boy again, standing by the window. This time, his face was fully visible, pale and expressionless, with dark, hollow eyes. He raised a small hand and waved goodbye as the train pulled away, vanishing into the tunnel. Later, Sarah recounted her experience to a subway worker, hoping for some sort of explanation. The worker's face turned pale. He told her about a child who had gone missing in the subway decades ago after being separated from his parents during an evacuation. Despite countless searches, the boy was never found. Since then, passengers had occasionally reported seeing a boy fitting his description, always late at night, always alone, and always searching for his parents. Sarah never took the subway after dark again. Even now, years later, she avoids tunnels and underground spaces. But sometimes, in the quiet hours of the night, she dreams of the boy's hollow eyes and wonders if he ever found what he was looking for. It was a routine that Megan had followed for years, taking the subway home after her late-night shifts at the cafe. The city was alive during the day, but at night, the subway was a different world entirely. The platforms were deserted, the fluorescent lights buzzed faintly, and the distant sound of footsteps echoed unnervingly through the empty tunnels. Megan didn't mind it, though. She always considered herself rational, not the type to scare easily. That changed on one particular night. Her shift had run longer than usual, and by the time she boarded the train, the clock was nearing 1 a.m. She stepped into the subway car, greeted by silence. It was completely empty. The hum of the train and the occasional creak of metal were the only sounds as she chose a seat near the middle. As the train rattled forward, Megan settled into her seat and pulled out her phone, scrolling absent-mindedly. A few minutes later, she felt it, a strange sensation, like someone was watching her. She looked up and scanned the car, but she was still alone. She shrugged it off and went back to her phone, telling herself it was just her imagination. Then she heard it. Faint, deliberate footsteps. They were soft but distinct, echoing through the car. Megan froze, her heart starting to race. She slowly turned her head toward the far end of the car, expecting to see someone walking toward her. But there was no one. The footsteps stopped. Megan's breath quickened as she tried to convince herself it was nothing. Maybe the sound was coming from another car or even outside the train. She forced herself to relax, but the feeling of being watched persisted, prickling at the back of her neck. A few minutes later, the footsteps started again, closer this time. The sound was heavier, more deliberate, as if whoever or whatever was making them wanted her to know they were there. Megan whipped her head around, scanning the car again, but it was empty. Her hands trembled as she clutched her bag tightly. She glanced at her reflection in the window beside her, hoping to catch a glimpse of the source of the sound. That's when she saw it. Standing just behind her reflection was a shadowy figure. It was faint and almost translucent, like a smudge of darkness against the dimly lit subway car. The figure was unnaturally tall, its form blurry and undefined, but there was no mistaking its presence. Megan's heart dropped. She spun around, ready to confront whatever was there, but the space behind her was empty. The footsteps resumed, now echoing louder and more erratically, as if the figure was circling her. Megan bolted out of her seat and ran toward the door at the far end of the car. She slammed her hand against the emergency button, but nothing happened. The train kept moving, and the lights flickered ominously. The footsteps stopped again. Megan turned back toward her seat, and this time, she saw the figure directly. It was standing in the aisle, motionless and staring at her, or at least she thought it was. Its face was obscured, a swirling mass of blackness where its features should have been. The train screeched to a halt at the next station. Without waiting for the doors to fully open, Megan shoved her way out and sprinted onto the platform. She didn't stop until she reached the stairs, her chest heaving with panic. She dared to glance back at the subway car as the train began to pull away. The figure stood in the doorway, its shadowy form blending into the darkness. For a moment, it almost seemed to wave at her before disappearing into the night. After that night, Megan never rode the subway alone again. She couldn't explain what had happened, and every time she told the story, people would laugh or dismiss it as exhaustion playing tricks on her mind. But Megan knew the truth. Something or someone was on that train with her, and whoever it was, they wanted her to know she wasn't alone.